So, what happens when a successful businessman passes away? Well, in this case, he leaves behind a fortune and a really bitter family feud that all comes down to two handwritten notes. This is an incredible story of anger, inheritance, and a legal battle that went all the way to the Supreme Court, only to be decided by one tiny crucial mistake. Okay, let's get into it.
Wow, just take in those words for a second. These were written by a father, Chiang I-pen, about his own son. It's a simple, brutal sentence at the very heart of a decade-long fight over a massive estate. You can practically feel the anger just radiating off the page, can't you?
And that right there is the million-dollar question, or in this case, the billion-dollar question. Can a father's fury, scribbled on a piece of paper, actually override the legal rights of his child? As the Chiang family was about to find out, the answer is way, way more complicated than you'd think.
All right, to really understand this whole mess, we have to go back to the beginning. We need to look at the source of all this conflict, the father's own words, and the family fights that pushed him to write them down in the first place.
See, this isn't just some abstract legal case from a textbook. No, this is a family drama. You've got a father who built a business empire from the ground up, and his 5 kids who ended up on opposite sides of a courtroom after he was gone.
The seeds for this whole legal war were planted years and years before the father passed away. It started back in 1998. There were arguments over rent money, and that's when he wrote the first note, which he called Last Words. Then, fast forward 6 years to 2004, he's still angry about property disputes, so he writes a second, much harsher note, calling it The Proof. So when he finally passed away in 2013, these two documents were basically ticking time bombs just waiting to explode.
And these 2 notes? They created a huge puzzle for the courts. I mean, look at him. The first one from '98, it kind of divides up property, but then it ends with this really bizarre, vague phrase, price to be negotiated separately. What does that even mean, right? But then you've got the second note, which is just brutally clear, no wiggle room, no negotiation, just, I will not give him a cent. So are they both wills? And if so, which one wins?
So, armed with these 2 totally conflicting documents, the case first lands in the district court. And their job was to somehow figure out what the father wanted while also following the very strict rules of the law. The district court basically tried to find a middle ground. They said, okay, yep, both of these notes look like valid wills. And yes, the father was clearly furious with his son, no question there. But, and this is a really big but, they ruled that the son's actions, which were really just about money and property, they didn't meet the high legal bar for major abuse or insult. And that's what you need to legally disinherit an heir completely.
Now, the reason the court did that comes down to a super important legal concept called the compulsory portion. See, in Taiwan, like in a lot of countries, the law basically says you can't just completely cut your kid out of the will. There's a legally protected minimum slice of the pie that they're entitled to no matter what. So the father's angry wish to give his son not a cent ran smack into this legal safety net.
So what was the court's solution? A compromise. They gave the son his legally protected minimum, which in this case worked out to 10% of the estate. The other 90% was split between his 4 siblings. You know, it seems logical, right? It sounds like a fair, legally sound decision. But guess what? Nobody was happy.
The other siblings felt their father's wishes were being ignored, and the son probably felt he deserved more. So they appealed. The case moved up to the High Court, and this is where things took a really dramatic turn. The High Court gets the case, looks at the exact same 2 notes, and comes to a totally different conclusion. They didn't see any need for a compromise. They saw a very clear instruction from a father that needed to be followed.
So how'd they do it?
It's pretty clever, actually. The High Court basically demoted that first note. They said the 1998 Last Words wasn't really a will at all. It was just a set of instructions for how to manage property while the father was still alive. That weird phrase, price to be negotiated separately, kind of backed him up. So they pushed it aside and focused everything on the 2004 proof, calling it the father's one true binding instruction. His intent was to disinherit, and they decided to honor that as much as the law would let them.
Oh, and to make things even crazier, during the appeal, the estate was reappraised. The value went from about 24 million new Taiwan dollars to over 120 million. That's about 4 million US dollars. Suddenly, that little 10% share was worth a whole lot more money, and the fight got even more intense.
So the case, now worth a lot more, and with a totally flipped decision, gets appealed again. This time, it lands in front of Taiwan's Supreme Court.
But they weren't interested in the family drama or the father's anger. Their focus was going to be on the math.
You know, the Supreme Court just sidestepped the entire emotional mess. They didn't try to weigh the father's intent against the son's rights. Nope. Instead, their whole judgment came down to a single, tiny procedural error in the High Court's calculations. An error that would end up invalidating the entire ruling.
And here it is. This is the line from the Supreme Court that changed everything. The law is crystal clear. When you figure out an heir's compulsory share, you have to use the net value of the estate. That means you take the total value and then you subtract any debts and, this is the key part, all the taxes. The High Court had forgotten to do that.
So let's break this down. What exactly was this mistake, and why was it a big enough deal to send this multi-million-dollar inheritance case all the way back to square one?
The process is supposed to be simple, right? Step 1, you figure out the gross value of everything. All the property, cash, the whole shebang. That was the NT dollars $120 million. Step 2, you subtract the liabilities. In this case, there was an inheritance tax of over NT dollars $921,000 that had already been paid. Then, and only then, for step 3, do you calculate the 10% share from that smaller net amount.
The High Court messed up on step 2. They calculated the son's 10% share from the gross estate, that full $120 million. But the law says you have to subtract debts and taxes first. Now, it might not sound like a huge difference in the grand scheme of things, but by calculating the share from the wrong total, their entire ruling was legally flawed. They had accidentally awarded the son slightly more money than the law said he was entitled to.
And that one little math error, it was enough for the Supreme Court to invalidate the entire High Court ruling. They didn't just fix the number and call it a day. No, they sent the whole case back down to be re-argued from the very beginning. Can you imagine? After years of fighting, millions in legal fees, the Chang family was right back where they started, just stuck in legal limbo.
This whole incredible story really gets at a fundamental tension in the legal system. On one hand, you have a father's intent, and it was crystal clear, written in his own hand. But on the other, you have the machinery of the law, with its very precise, very strict rules. At the end of the day, it forces us to ask, what really matters more? A person's obvious wishes, or the cold, hard letter of the law?